Welcome. I'm Russ Rapp, and this is my live talk about non-duality. In this video, we're going to focus the discussion on the idea of faith versus works. So how does faith and works relate to non-duality? Because that's part of the difficulty with talking about non-duality is finding ways to kind of frame the conversation, because non-duality is really simple. We could really narrow it down in a quick little snippet. The understanding or connection to non-duality is instantaneous, so it's not something that you can learn. But I enjoy doing these long form talks regarding the subject just because it's something I like to do. But as far as understanding non-duality, it's really just the idea that, if you look at the word not to, there's this illusion of separation that we have kind of inherently built in within ourselves. So it's kind of pointing to those structures or habits that we have as individuals, as separate selves, that we have built around us, within us, that kind of create this illusion that we that appears all around us, essentially. So that's a quick snippet. So, which is all well and good. If I were to make shorter, more digestible videos and work on making sure the title is nice and concise and written in a way that you get something out of it, then I'd probably get more people to join me and watch some of the videos that I make. My most popular video is the best method to achieve non-duality. And I think just the title alone kind of shows you what people are interested in when it comes to this subject. They want to find something, learn something, understand something, have this epiphany or awakening, this moment of enlightenment that lasts for all eternity and that sort of thing. And so it's this pull to this sense of seeking that people are trying to strive to achieve some pinnacle of enlightenment. So that's where, what I like to do is point to that and show people that that in itself is an illusion or a distraction. But people find comfort in that, which I guess isn't necessarily a bad thing. So in this video, we're going to talk about faith versus works, or faith versus deeds, and how it relates to non-duality. So if you're still confused on the subject and you enjoy listening kind of a longer form explanation, you've come to the right spot. I typically prefer doing these live talks because they are live and anything can potentially happen. The infinite possibilities are endless, essentially. And stumbling over my words or babbling could potentially ensue. But we'll just see where it goes. And so if you've joined us here now in this live talk on YouTube, you can write a comment or a question in the chat. At some point, I will address those in this discussion, and we can kind of go from there. If there's a burning question that you have regarding non-duality, what it means and what it means for your life, or what it doesn't mean, what does it mean to be a non-person, and that sort of thing. So let's get started into faith versus works, or faith versus deeds. And kind of to start out the discussion, I did find a website article that I thought was helpful in kind of framing what we're going to be talking about here in this video. It is on thegospelcoalition.org, and I will put a link in the description below so you can go right to it. I'm not familiar with this website exactly, but I thought it was a handy article. The article is Faith and Works, an essay by Thomas Schreiner. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read the first sections of it. The definition of faith versus and works. The Reformed Protestant understanding of the relationship between faith and works is that salvation comes by faith in Christ alone, and the good works performed by believers aren't the basis of salvation, but should be understood as the necessary evidence of that salvation. Summary: the question of the relationship between faith and works is central to the division between Protestants and Roman Catholics. Throughout the Bible, we see that salvation is received not on the basis of works, but on the basis of faith in God alone. Jesus himself emphasizes this through many parables and sayings, and Paul argues explicitly against the inclusion of works in the basis of our salvation. James, though arguing that justification by works and not by faith alone can be harmonized with the rest of the New Testament, when it is realized that James still expects us to sin. He is combating faith without works, not faith alone as the basis of salvation. So the entirety of the New Testament teaches that we are justified by faith alone, but the faith that justifies necessarily flowers into good works. So I like my background as a Christian. That's where I like to focus some of my energy of how to really communicate this idea of non-duality. Other speakers or teachers talk from other, maybe teachers or speakers from the past or other ancient texts and use that or other parables or stories that they've come up with that have passed along through generations, and use those to kind of highlight some of the ideas behind non-duality. Hey, Mallory, good morning. So, as you maybe caught, we're talking about faith and works and the Bible. So I wanted to read, I believe it's Hebrews. Let me find it here. There's a whole section in Hebrews on faith and deeds. I remember what page it's on. Oh, that's James. Give me 1 second here. 846. All right, here we go. It is Hebrews. I should have maybe written this down so I've been prepared. Oh, yeah. Is this the one? Yeah, we'll try this. It's Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 through, I'll read through this is super exciting for you, I'm sure. I just read this last night, so I can't remember exactly where I wanted to read it through. Oh, here we go. Yeah. Okay, so it's 1 through 16. So Hebrews chapter 11, 1 through 16. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith he still speaks even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. he could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that came by faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, as he good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So that is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 through 16. And the thing, I like the verse where they talk about they were aliens and strangers on the earth. And so, when it comes to faith, the idea is that even if you don't see the consequence or the benefits of your current actions or beliefs, then that doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily apply to truth, I guess, if you will. So people, if you live by faith, you are doing things that may not see the direct benefit right away, or it takes a period of time, or maybe you're dead and you never see it. But faith is doing things because of inherently because of that, and not because you expect something in return. It's because you're doing it through faith. And the other verse I want to read real quick is from James. And that's James chapter 2, verse 14 through 26. And it's faith and deeds. What good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, "Go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself is not, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do." You believe that there is one God. Good, even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish man, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. Oh, in the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As with the body, without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. That's James. So if you you consider those verses from the Bible talking about faith versus works, or faith versus deeds, and you relate that to non-duality, when you talk about non-duality, not two, the mind wants to always have understanding or meaning. So one way that the mind works is to separate things into duality, essentially. And so it's self and other, up, down, left, right, all of that stuff. And when it comes to talking about this idea of faith versus works, it separates it in two different categories. But as you can see from what the book of James is trying to say in that chapter, is that there is no separation really between faith and deeds, essentially, where one is trying to say, I can do good deeds without faith, whereas when you have faith, the deeds come along with that, essentially. And so this idea with non-duality is, the question of, how do I have this non-dual awareness? How do I understand what non-duality is trying to say? How do I live my life in accordance to what non-duality is teaching, essentially? And so there's all these ideas and concepts as far as what it looks like, what it should appear like, how people should act, what kind of life you should live when there's this recognition of the non-dual oneness of everything, the nothing and everything together. Azus Zen Max Pro M1 says, "Hi Russ, I need your help in understanding why there is a certain pattern repeating in my life. No matter what I try and do, but it doesn't get resolved." Well, I think, this is goes along with, I'm not a therapist, but when it comes to patterns and habits, there's, I guess you could say, you could judge as good habits or bad habits, good habits meaning ones that you want to keep, and bad habits ones that you want to get rid of, which someone else's opinion could say that your habits that you want to keep aren't necessarily good habits, but you just want to do them. It's instinctual, it's repetitive. It's kind of like how the mind works. If you think you understand non-duality of this subject, the mind will come up with countless ways to question that if you just allow it to do its job and try to create meaning. It's a never-ending cycle, and a lot of the ideas are repetitive, or maybe they're not even your ideas. When it comes to why there's a certain pattern repeating in your life, I think a recognition of the pattern is usually the first step of seeing that there is a pattern, because a lot of times we go through life and don't realize that we're kind of living a script, or we're living in Groundhog's Day of doing the same thing over and over again, and not realizing that's what's happening, or what kind of role we're playing in that dynamic. Or we point the finger and blame others for the situations that we see, whether it's like you date the same kind of person and your relationships always fail, and you wonder why that happens, or whatever the repeating pattern is. But when you try and resolve them and it doesn't get resolved, I guess that's, the cop-out answer in non-duality is that's what appears to be happening, which isn't helpful. But that's where it comes to this topic of faith versus deeds, or what you do versus what you are. And so non-duality tends to focus on this idea of being, or a state of being. People talk about non-dual awareness, or some level of consciousness, or depth of being, or however you want to describe it, versus actions versus doing. So you have this idea of being something, or being everything or doing something. So that's where the conundrum is, the catch-22 is when you want to try to use non-duality to change something in your life, then it's like calls into question what's the point of non-duality in the first place? Because if I were to tell you, Azus, that the pattern appears because it seems to appear, and I say that time is an illusion, that the connection that you have with God, or this idea of the infinite non-dual, infinite non-dual existence of life, the aliveness of what is, you may get frustrated because your answer is not being met. You're not getting a response that you would like to have to understand how you can change the pattern that you have in your life. But the recognition that there is a pattern and that something is happening in a repetitive nature is underlying that is the freedom of release, of letting go, that it always exists in all times and every moment. And so even if you're having these struggles, or if you're having repetitive thoughts or behaviors or things that appear in your life in a kind of habitual or repetitive way, there's always this sense of forgiveness or freedom underlying that. There's this emptiness, this, like, kind of like when, have you ever been in those amusement parks, or like the county fairs where they have this room where you all get in this circular room that spins, and you stand against the wall, and all of a sudden the room starts spinning real fast, and then your feet come off the ground because you're obviously the centrifugal force and the gravity, whatever, changes. And so now you're kind of floating against the wall. You're not touching the ground anymore. You're weightless in a way, sort of. That's where, what was the point of that? I had a point to that. I got so caught up in the experience of standing against the wall and floating. And this is where, you can take those moments that you try to grasp an idea or try to understand something, try to communicate something, and the words fail you. You can't think of what to say. And that can be frustrating. And then you get frustrated, and then you get frustrated at your frustration. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. But nothing changes in this experience of what is, essentially. So whether or not your patterns are repeating doesn't change anything about the message. It has nothing to do with it, but has everything to do with it, because faith and deeds are ultimately connected. But we're going to talk a little bit more about, the message of non-duality, the concept of non-duality, and how we can frame it around our belief about faith versus works, or being versus doing. Mallory says, message retracted. So Mallory wrote something she didn't want to write, so she took that away. She deleted her message because it wasn't quite up to snuff. Mallory says, faith is non-duality, basically identifying with truth. Deeds happen apparently as the self. The ego's deeds are delusional, in my opinion. So when it comes to, okay, so this is, I guess we can get into kind of my thoughts on what you just said. You're welcome, Azus. I think when it comes to looking at faith versus deeds, or, a faith versus what you do with your life, or what kind of actions you choose to take, a lot of it is framing who is in control. And it's kind of like the old cliche analogy of the chicken versus the eggs. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? You can have a discussion. Ultimately, it's a great question. It's kind of like the whole idea of one hand clapping. What's the sound does it make? But when it comes to the chicken and the egg, it's kind of the idea of how do you have something that creates life? How do you have something that creates an egg if the egg that produces that thing wasn't there in the first place? So how do you have, it's kind of the idea of unmanifest versus manifest, or something coming from nothing. Like, how does life appear? And in science, they talk about the Big Bang, and there was nothing. And then all of a sudden there's this giant bang. All this energy is created, and then it changed forms, and it, goes from hydrogen molecules and helium to more complex molecules and structuring and all of that stuff. And we talk about the idea of creation, and the word was God, and the word was spoken, and everything that came from nothing was created by God. But when it comes to this concept of non-duality, really it's, so the chicken and the egg are kind of intertwined. Like, you can't have one without the other when it comes to that. But it, if you go all the way down, it comes back to the same idea of nothingness versus everything, and how does things manifest out of nothing? Empty space. We're all empty space. If you look at it, we're energy that vibrates, but there's no essentially matter. It's the idea, the physics conundrum of waveform, versus matter. The wave particle theory, essentially. So this idea of existence. So the chicken or the egg. Well, how did the egg come if there was no chicken, or how did the chicken come if there was no egg initially? And so it's kind of a mind game. Ultimately, those are connected, so you can't have one without the other. You have to have the seed of existence and the existence simultaneously. But when it comes to non-duality, really, the framework that is a helpful pointer is this idea of who is the one doing the deeds, essentially. Who is the one having faith? Who is the one that is ultimately the creator of reality, essentially? And a lot of speakers talk about this idea of there is no person, or there is no one, or no one showed up to this talk. There's no one that's chatting in the chat, or no one's listening on the other end. There's just this. And so the kind of what that is pointing to is this idea of your will, you right there, whether it's a Zeus or Mallory or whoever else is watching. It's the question of your will versus God's will. Life is but a dream. So the focus of, if you have the duality of faith versus works, the focus on works of having to do something, having to meditate, having to have this awakening experience that lasts infinitely, having to have this epiphany moment where you understand, now I know the truth, now I understand what non-duality is pointing to. That is the attempt of the separate will, the ego, if you will, whatever you want to call it, to try to obtain this idea, this understanding of non-duality, or the truth of existence. And so it's reinforcing the thing that is already there, that the thing that we point to and say, well, that's the problem, my mental state, or the habitual nature of my behavior, or my repetitive thoughts, or the belief in existence, or the attachment to the body, or however you want to describe it. that is seen to be the issue when it comes to people when they talk about non-duality. And when you focus on the deed side of it, as far as being able to do something, to have the forgiveness, to have the infinite love that is always available, then it's kind of a contractual thing where I have to do this to receive love. I have to do this to find truth. I have to do this to find peace. And that's where it puts it on you as your individual will to find all of that. It's the seeking energy that is trying to seek to find the truth of non-duality. And that's where the focus lies, on you doing something versus focusing on faith alone. Because when you put your emphasis on the faith side of that dualistic kind of separation in the conversation, when you focus on faith, has nothing to do with you. It's other than the sense that the recognition that you can't do it. So it's a giving up of your will. It's a giving up of trying to control life, or trying to be the master of your domain, or trying to do something in order to achieve something. And so when you put your faith into life, put your faith in God, into Jesus, essentially what that's saying is that the whole idea of Jesus take the wheel, it's giving up your will and saying, thy will be done, God's will be done. And that's where that's where the peace is found, because you're giving that first versus reinforcing the separation through the focus on doing a good deed or being a good person or the works involved in it. And so the question becomes, okay, so I put my faith in God, or I give myself and say, life, come as you will. I'm open to everything that you will throw at me, essentially. I've said essentially like 7 times. So if you're playing a drinking game right now, it's either and so or essentially. When you put your focus on doing something, then you're essentially see, even when I try to not to say essentially, it just comes out. So that there is that lack of control that I have. So I could tell myself I don't want to say essentially, or I don't want to say and so as a transition phrase, and yet that's what happens. And so see, I just said it again. So when people say, oh, I have control over my life, I can raise my hand, I can lower my hand, see, I'm doing this, it's kind of an illusion, because it's a simple thing simple action that you say you're doing. But the reason why that seems to be such a simple action that your will is doing is because the time frame is such a short time frame. If you were to say, I'm going to be sitting in this exact position in 2 weeks, it's going to be at this time, and I'm going to have the same sweatshirt on, I'm going to do the same thing. Now the time span of your will being done is over a longer period. And so there's that transition phrase. Over the long period, you could say, well, this is exactly what's going to happen. But let's say you get hit by a car and now you're in a hospital. You're no longer here in 2 weeks. You don't have the same sweatshirt on, and you're not able to fulfill this grand will that you think you have. And so the illusion is that the belief that you can do this and that, you have a lot more things going on within you, other systems and structures that allow you to think that you have this will that can really have this major control over your life, where it's really you're dependent just as much as you are independent on the structures, your heart beating, your lungs working, your mind working, your cells dividing, your cells growing into, constantly being regenerated. All these things happen for you to think on the superficial level that I can abstractly raise and lower my hand, and that somehow proves that I am a powerful, willful wolf a person. And then within that conversation, then it gets into kind of the morality of, okay, well, you're saying that you have no will or you have no control over your actions. Then what happens? Like, does that give you, do what thou wilt, or do whatever you want without consequence, or don't care what other people think, or uh, that sort of thing? And that gets into a whole moral conversation, which essentially has nothing to do with non-duality, because it's the same idea of faith versus works, not faith, even though I keep trying to say that, faith versus works. So those go hand in hand, and that's what James essentially is saying in his book of the Bible, is you can't have one without the other. And we try to find meaning or try to define what that looks like, what living a faithful life looks like, but ultimately it manifests as it does. But if you put your faith first, then everything else falls into place, regardless of what that actually specifically looks at. But we, as the fearful mind, the egoic mind, wants to know, well, I want to know how to live. I want to know how to. So then the morality of being a good person, doing good deeds, naturally follows this idea of seeing the connection of all things, of the truth of non-duality, of the infinite love that we see around us. But at the same time, as so James had pointed out, that we're all sinners essentially, and so we try, but we need that forgiveness, because we ultimately fail when it comes to living up to the standards of righteousness that we try to uphold. And so we repeat ourselves, like saying, and so we repeat ourselves by saying, essentially, we repeat the same habits, and we have to basically get on our knees and say, please, God, forgive me, for I have sinned. And that's the meaning of sin when it comes to forgiveness, because we try to do it all ourselves. We try to do our own, forgive ourselves, which there's a process of that as well. But ultimately, forgiveness comes from God, not from you. Because with forgiveness as a separate self, it's a contractual thing. There's always you have to do this or you have to do that in order to be forgiven, and that can be taken away. If something is given by yourself, it can be taken away. Or if you forgive someone else, you can always take that away. Whereas the love of God, the forgiveness of God is always ever present, cannot be taken away. You can believe it doesn't exist. You can buy into the illusion, but the truth, the love of God, is always there. Mallory says, totally, it's so liberating, not identifying with the seeking. That's forgiveness. Life and the person is so much more funny when apparent surrender happens. Faith seems to happen when it happens. Yeah, so I think kind of what you're saying is, I guess even from my experience, this is what gets into the whole story and how my life goes, which can be a distraction when it comes to non-duality, because that's not what this is about. And partly because I don't like talking about myself, but when it comes to having, like Zeus said, this idea of the certain pattern that can't get resolved, in those experiences, when I have habitual issues or anxiety or whatever stress or anger that comes up or appears, there's this, there's a tendency to want to attach to it and to identify with all of that. And even through that identification, that's okay, essentially. So when you're attaching to the anger, you're identifying and you're aware of your identification, because a lot of times this whole non-duality stuff is very meta. And so you're always observing that which it seems to be doing something. So you're seeing yourself in the third person, essentially, or as an object or someone that's doing something. And so the observer, who now is unidentified, even though you're identified with it, sees your behavior, your actions, your thought processes, and analyzes that, judges that, essentially. even though the judger, the observer, is the same thing essentially as the behaviors that you're witnessing. But even in those moments where you're attached to your behavior and you're aware of what you're doing, you're aware of the mechanics of your habits, there's this freedom in that where that's okay. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be, essentially kind of saying, we're all sinners. Essentially, the original sin of seeking knowledge of, that's where, there's the duality of God versus Satan. There's one is an illusion, one is a lie, one is deceit. One is, the ultimate, falseness, the false reality, the black sun, if you will. You have the idea of Satan as Lucifer, the light bringer. And so Satan as Lucifer is essentially, see, there's that essentially again. It just comes up because that's what happens. When you think of the idea of Lucifer, Lucifer is the one bringing light or knowledge or the apple from the tree of life to tempt Adam and Eve to say, hey, here's this knowledge, here's this wisdom, here's this self-knowledge that you can become like God or become God. And that's where the deception lies, is that through this separate entity, you can now become everything, whereas the reverse is true, where the separate entity, the light, if you will, is different when it comes to this idea of Lucifer versus the light of God, where light of God is truth, Lucifer light is illusion, is the matrix, the dream world, that which we believe to be real, that which we feel gives us power, but ultimately as a separate entity, we are powerless. And so it's kind of a super overcompensation for the fact that we feel so incredibly powerless as a tiny human being on this giant earth in this huge universe. So we ask, people go to, things like, Lucifer and all this other esoteric stuff and say, give me the power and the wisdom because I'm a scared separate self. And so then Satan or Lucifer comes in and says, hey, I will give you knowledge, I will give you this, and this will give you power. But it's just a deception, because it gives you nothing, because you already have everything, because you are a child of God, you are already connected. But as a separate self, you seek that which can give you something that you already have. And that's the lie. Mallory says, the tree of illusion of good and evil. Yeah, I think, when we dualistically separate ideas like that as good and evil and say, well, good and evil itself is an illusion, that can be confusing, because it goes back to the idea of no consequence, essentially, from a moralistic, ethical standpoint. And so if there is no good and evil, I can do whatever I want and not be concerned over the consequence. Where I think it's a kind of a twisting of the thought process. If you say, justice be done, may the heavens fall, or, I follow God's will regardless of the consequence. I'm not focused on what happens as long as I do what's right in the eyes of God. That's different than saying there is no good and evil. I can do whatever I want, treat anyone however I want. And because the clear, obvious reality of that is when you say there is no good and evil, and you take from others, you treat others, you steal from them, you abuse them, you harm them, you suck the energy out of their life, or you try to become powerful by putting others down. That, in a sense, is reinforcing the fact that there is a separation there. And in the tree of illusion of good and evil, I would say it's an illusion of good and evil in the sense that Einstein put it when someone asked him, is the universe good or bad, or I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but he said something to the effect of, all the things that he's learned that the universe is good. I just totally butchered that whole quote, but you get the idea. Is the universe itself is infinite love, and the idea of trying to here's how I would word it. So there's infinite love. So the illusion of good and evil is an illusion, as in the separation is an illusion. But when you take the separation of good and evil and try to shove it back together as a unification, that's a false unity. That's a false coming together, because you're still, the belief of good and evil is still there, and you're trying to force them together in order to do your will, essentially. And by forcing that together, it's something you're saying that I can do no wrong. I am who I am, and it's really a focus on self-centeredness, selfishness in the negative sense, versus truth. Mallory says, yes, there is apparently karma. I mean, there is only good, really. Yeah, I like the idea of karma in the sense that there is, I think it's kind of instant karma in a way. I don't get into the idea of multiple lives or past lives. I'm not saying that doesn't necessarily exist or not. I don't have no idea, but or reincarnation, that sort of thing. As far as karma goes, I guess that's not really my concern, or concern of non-duality of what happens after we die. It's more of what's the reality of what is, or what's happening in this moment, the power of now kind of idea. But when it comes to karma, I think of it more like instant karma that maybe happens over a period of time. So the karma, or the consequence of what happens, the action, already is in place. So the truth of reality is already there. It's already apparent, but it may, through the illusion of time, take a period of time to manifest, essentially. So you may see it as like, if I treat someone poorly, the instant karma is how I feel about myself and my identification with that, and feeling like a bad person or whatever. Or it could be, you treat someone poorly, that comes back to you through a negative feedback loop, but it may take a period of time. But I think ultimately the truth of reality, or truth of what is, or is always ever present, even though it may seem like it takes time. But that's where patience comes into play, because sometimes you don't see, like in the Bible verses I read, where it talked about all these people from the Bible, and that they all died basically before they were able to see the fruits of having a strong faith in God. That's really pointing to the fact that time plays a factor, and it's really not a matter of achieving something or having the benefit of the action, or seeing the consequence in your own lifetime necessarily, or in the moment. It's something that will happen because it will be done. I'm going to get a little bit more of a refresher. Any more questions or comments? We'll continue here. All right, so I got through a lot of what I wanted to talk about in this video. Is there anything that you would like to specifically focus on outside of faith and works, or maybe you still have questions on that, but let's just be curious. Maybe as I'm waiting, I'll see. Maybe there's a couple comments I can read. Oh. Mallory says, I have a recent theory. We cultivate more free will in disidentifying with the ego, and then we can be creative more in life and use faith. What I would say to that is, I think that gets a little into human development, personal development. I think there's an intimate connection between how a society or culture develops and how we as human beings develop from birth to throughout the stages in life. And if you look at, if you read the Bible, you see that some of it is, well, it's obviously in the context of the culture that it is written in, the time period that it's written in. And the issues that we deal with as human beings are essentially go throughout time periods throughout history. And so we deal with a lot of the same stuff, but the framework, how we communicate it, the language we use can change. And when it comes to like, for instance, the website I read was Faith versus Works, and it talked about Roman Catholics versus Protestants. So a big part of the Protestant movement, so they're both identify as Christians or the Christian faith. But if you look at where that split came, some of it had to do with, and I'm not an expert on this, but some of it had to do with this issue of faith versus works. And if you look at the Catholic faith, there's a lot more structure, hierarchy within that community of having a priest. And then you go back in time where the average person maybe couldn't read, or didn't have access to books, didn't have access to the Bible, or didn't have enough background to be able to understand what the Bible was saying, didn't maybe understand, Hebrew or, the interpretation of the Bible. So there was a heavier dependency on others for that wisdom, that knowledge. So there's this idea of really being more dependent on the structure of the church, whereas with the printing press, of more access to information, of books, maybe more literacy, people were able to take that and kind of do their own thing. And so there was less dependency on others in order to have a direct connection through the Bible to God, essentially. There's that word again. And so there's all these structures in place at the time. Protestantism's, focus more on the faith versus, whereas Catholicism has, you go to confession and it's being, doing good things or following certain rules. There's a lot more rule based. And part of that had to do with, if you talk about spiral dynamics and human development, it's the blue meme, essentially, where, oh man. So yeah, watch this video again and grab yourself a margarita or something and take a sip every time I say it, or a beer or whatever you want to drink, or a tea or water or milk or, whatever's appropriate. But this idea of within the understanding of the Bible in that culture, in that time period in Catholicism, there was all this structure around that, all of this kind of sense of community, or this focus on, it was more about the community versus the individual. And then you have, the Enlightenment period and this idea of the individual being more at the focus of society, of, what can you do? What do you have power over? The individual will. Kind of the American society of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is not, your family lineage as much, or it's not your background, or, anything like that. It's, this idea, the American dream of being able to come from nothing and gain all this wealth and power through hard work, dedication, everything that goes with it. Having, good ideas and putting those ideas to practice. So there's this change in focus in society. And, as a shift back to more of a collectivist cooperation reality, the focus on others as we're transitioning into a different form, we're seeing kind of the pinnacle pros and cons of this idea of individualism, and it's becoming more apparent. And so the reverse of individualism is kind of this disidentification with the individual or the ego. And so when it comes to finding more creativity through disidentification, I think there's some truth in the form of human development, because it's transitioning kind of to a different stage, where if you look at individualism, and I have this whole thing, and kind of a lot of it has to do with like Ken Wilber and spiral dynamics and stuff, and some of the things I've learned, but it's this whole structure of life. But ultimately, as we grow and develop, there's more complexity, more power that comes to the individual versus, when you're a hunter-gatherer, or if you're in a society that has heavily structured and has kings and queens or bishops or whatever, there's less focus on the individual as far as, separating of duties. And so you have, kind of the idea of building Ford cars, Henry Ford, and the assembly line is, you can have more differentiated activities, more focus on you build this, you build this, you build this, expertise and specifications. And you didn't have that back when you were just more in a survival mode as much, because everyone had to chip in, everyone had to do these things. There wasn't as much of a opportunity to have more specialized knowledge, essentially. There's essentially, again, and with more complexity within a society or a culture, more opportunity to be creative, because you have the flexibility to do so. It's kind of like the idea of working 9 to 5. What a way to make a living. So, if you're focused on making money and you're focused on trying to provide and just to kind of survive day to day, paycheck to paycheck, your ability to be more creative with your time and your focus, having hobbies or interests and that sort of thing is a lot more limited if you're having to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs or trying to support a family and you're struggling. You can't focus on those things, and you also can't focus on having power within a society because you don't have time necessarily to follow the news or to hold your politicians' feet to the fire or do any of that stuff to some extent because you're in a state of trying to maintain a level of subsistence living, trying to survive through the grind. And so that's where, yes, I think there is somewhat of a cultural or developmental aspect to disidentification with the ego, but that's not a prerequisite to non-duality. Non-duality is within every time period, every culture. It's not dependent on your belief system or where you are as a person or how you identify with the world as yourself. But I think there is the people that find interest or connect with this message of non-duality. A lot of times they're in similar situations, and that reminds me of one thing that I commented on that someone had written. So SBN Resonate wrote a comment on my lies about non-duality video, and they said, "It really annoys me that the first thing it says when you look up non-duality is in spirituality, which I don't think that word should be added to the real meaning at all, because right when you put spiritualism in the name, it's going to fly right past our heads from what it really means, and people's beliefs will get in the way from truly letting go of what they think they need, and they don't see that they don't. We already have what we are supposed to be. Or no, sorry. We already are what we are supposed to be. We don't have to try or work our way to being another you and me. There is no such thing. I speak about these things on my channel here but most people don't seem to understand because of the things we have been indoctrinated with and conditioned by." SPN Resonate. So apparently, I guess I haven't checked out their channel, but oops. So I can't endorse it, but you can always check it out if you want. It's a free country. And then I responded, "Exactly. I think that's a big part of why I continue making videos on YouTube in this niche or niche, because it's where you find those with the in spirituality mindset trying to grab onto the mystical carrot." My point is that, we all have come to this with our own biases or opinions, and I'm no different. And so I recognize that in others. I recognize the pitfalls or the potential other things that we jump to believe in that aren't really true, or the traps that we fall into. And that's kind of where my focus is. I guess I don't really spend as much time with discussing non-duality from people that aren't familiar. It's more focused on people that are more familiar, that fall into this issue of trying to live up to some standard or bar that they place on themselves that has nothing to do with non-duality. Mallory says, "So seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you, like blessing others, as seeking happens, of course." Yes, seeking happens. Yeah, Russ, but I want my life to be different. What life? What story are you telling yourself? What's happening right now in this moment? Is this what you want to change? I was watching Eagle Brook Church service this morning, and one of the things they suggested was take a week and don't complain. So no complaining for a week, just 1 week. Really focus on trying to be appreciative and not to complain about stuff. And, that can be a difficult thing, but it's something that you can try. And through that trying, maybe you'll have a different perspective of the world. When you change your habits, like Azus was saying about habits, is if you continue the habits and you don't try something different, even if there's an apparent struggle or fight in order to maintain the current habits, there's a recognition that there is a fight. How do you know someone if you don't fight them? Seraph says in the Matrix, in the second Matrix. So you want to try to change those habits. If you don't do anything different, you'll never know the ramifications of your current behavior or habits. So you have to try something different in order to make that comparison. You have to, in order to see it, observe it, to recognize that habit, you have to be able to do something different. And so then it becomes, well, how do I do something? It's my will. I have to do this. Maybe, but if you can't seem to do it, maybe that's those moments that you ask for forgiveness, that you ask for help, whether it's people around you or you pray to God and say, I need your help. I can't do this on my own. It's in those moments that you maybe find the will or the desire to change. And so am I going to be able to stop complaining for a week? Well, I guess we'll see. It's hard when you live in the tundra to not complain about the weather. I'm going to do about 5 more minutes, so we're just going to wrap this up. Mallory says, well, I just enjoy some non-duality content and contemplation and meditation. Why strive to change that? That's great. I appreciate, it's nice to have you on board here to be able to have some back and forth communication. Because like I said, I enjoy this more long form discussion format versus, making shorter digestible videos that YouTube will probably promote more and get more views and all that. But I just have no desire to make those as much at this point in time. So I like this long form. So even if I say essentially or and so 15 times in a video, or if I stumble or babble or mess up my words, it's out there. But that's the funny thing about non-duality, is it doesn't need anyone to explain it or to prove it, or like science and non-duality is using science to try to say, hey, we're right, we got the truth here. It's like non-duality doesn't need you to do that. The truth is already there. The cat's already out of the bag. The genie's already out of the bottle. There's no putting it back in. It's kind of like the idea of karma is you can't. It's there. There's no stopping it. Mallory said, right? I've enjoyed it. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining. And I think the best really is yet to come. But that's just a story. I just appreciate you taking the time to stick with me this long and sit through this long form live talk. I think though it's a small community, I think there is a group that, comes together when over the topic of non-duality, and I think that's a good thing. So I will put the link to that one article at some point in the video, the Gospel Coalition one, in case you want to read that in its full form. And I guess we're going to wrap this up. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed to my channel and you've watched an hour and almost 14 minutes, I think that's pretty telling that you should really subscribe, because when I do these live talks, oftentimes it's on like the weekend here, but sometimes I do random ones. But if you want to know kind of what time that I will be doing it, the best way is to subscribe, so then you have kind of the notification potentially, or you'll see it pop up to say, hey, tomorrow or later today is Russ Rapp is going to be doing a live talk. So you can join and participate. I should just let this go on for like just another half hour, just sit here, not say anything. It's like that, when young people, oftentimes if they're starting out in a relationship and, they're trying to get off the phone after talking for 2-3 hours, and, it's you hang up. No, you hang up. No, you hang up. Or I could just leave it going and go do something else. You could just stare at the blinds and a blank wall. And maybe you'll get more out of that. Maybe it'll be meditative for you. I think what sometimes people struggle with is being silent or doing things that don't seem to have any sort of purpose to them. Like, this is the end of the talk. We've already had the talk. We discussed it. Now there's just this period of time where nothing's really happening, just sitting up here babbling. So many people will probably have left a while ago because there's no purpose or point to this. But how is this any different than previous part of the discussion? Doesn't change anything about the nature of reality. Just something else is appearing. I'll leave you with 8:28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.